A few weeks ago, I published a video about why I considered that house prices would continue to rise. And as you would imagine, I received quite a number of comments. And one of the comments was that the fundamentals had changed, and therefore with the way that things move forward, particularly in the UK, was going to be different. My argument was actually they were circumstances that had changed that, so things such as interest rates, but the fundamentals had not changed. So let me just first of all define what I mean by fundamental and what I mean by circumstances. So a fundamental would be that at the present we power most of our cars through petrol or diesel. A fundamental change coming to that is that we are looking for alternative sources, whether electric be the case for the new way of powering cars. I suspect it's not, but nevertheless that would be a fundamental change, something like that. But if you look back over the last 100+ years, we've fundamentally powered our cars with petrol and then diesel. That became, so that's simply how we've powered our cars. So a change in circumstances could be, for instance, if we go back to like the 1970s when there was a shortage of fuel, and that made it very difficult for us to actually get around. Fuel prices went up, and it was in short supply. We almost had rationing. That would be a change of circumstances, because in a relatively short period of time that was going to correct. So that's the difference between fundamentals and circumstances. So my argument is that there are certain things that are fundamentals that have not changed in the housing market, and I'm going to go on to explain that, and what the circumstances are that have changed will make a difference in the short to medium term, but they don't alter the fundamentals. Incidentally, just when I was actually recording the original introduction to this video, it crashed for some reason, and I wasn't sure whether it was going to continue doing that. So we've got an unusual segue here into the next segment of the video. For some reason my camera's playing up and it keeps cutting out, so I'm not quite sure how this video will end up in the editing, should I say. So what I was going to say is we're going to talk about rent enclosure. So rent enclosure is the best way to describe it is, if you imagine before the settlement of North America, and you had the indigenous people, they lived on the land, they farmed the land, they basically looked after the land. Then the white settlers came from Europe, and they started to colonize the land. In other words, what they did was that they said, okay, we're going to carve up this land, and we're going to allow people to own the land. So that's what I mean by rent enclosure. So that's a fundamental that we have in society. It's something that's unlikely to go away. There was talk, in actual fact, with the Corbyn government. One of the things that they actually proposed was that they actually started to take back ownership of land. I think that would have led to some sort of revolution. I don't think we would have allowed that to happen, but it's a possibility. So that would be a fundamental. If that changed, then obviously that would be a change in the fundamentals. So hopefully that's kind of clear. Second thing is that all economic activity ends in the land. So what do I mean by that? So imagine you've got a particular area, and it's sustained by whatever industry is there, and a big employer moves into the area or decides to locate their head office or put some manufacturing in there. That then creates a demand for more jobs, so there's more jobs and employment goes up, but it also creates a demand for housing. And so what happens is that you find that the house prices in that area start to go up in value. Another situation will be where there's infrastructure spending by government and local authorities. So perhaps there could be several things, like for instance there's a bypass to a town. So when there's a bypass to a town, it alleviates the amount of traffic within that town or village, and therefore that makes it much more attractive, and that then creates an uplift in land values. Or for instance, if you take where there was the ground that was used for the London Olympics, or in Scotland where they used it for the Commonwealth Games, that land was pretty dormant, wasn't that terribly valuable. Once it was designated to be used for the redevelopment of the Commonwealth Games or the Olympic Games, those values went up, and of course then following on from that, there's always a regeneration project to actually enhance those particular facilities and enhance the land around there. So there's a lot of spending that comes in. That again pushes up the land value and therefore creates higher housing prices and commercial and also for commercial facilities. Just one thing I should just point out on that, most people's perception is that when house prices go up, it's the houses that go up. It's actually not. It's the land underneath the houses that are going up. Similarly, when it falls back, it's the land value underneath the houses that actually falls back. Houses itself, and I did a video about this quite some time ago, talking about how houses actually depreciate, and that sounds a bit controversial to a lot of people, but the reality is, if you think about it, you take a house that's maybe 40 years old, has had nothing done to it, somebody buys it, renovates it, does a lot of work to it, the value goes up. And the reason the value goes up, because it just basically aligns itself with a newer build of a similar standard. So the actual house, the fabric of the house has actually devalued, but the land underneath it has increased in value, so it appears overall that the land prices have gone up. Now, don't take my word for it. If you go to the US, they actually allow you to, on commercial property at least, they allow you to depreciate, in other words, take the actual building, so they separate land and buildings, and they allow you to actually take the building part of it and write it off as a depreciation against your profit. So on a balance sheet, that becomes a depreciating asset. Institutional lending. Institutional lending is alive and well and has been in place for many years. In the UK, our lending for private housing came traditionally from building societies. These were actually created in their early groups, where the group of people getting together who would club together and say, we want to build a house and we'll take turns, but we'll each continue to put the funds in until everybody has got a house. That developed into a much more commercial model, and then in the 80s banks started to get into lending, and there's alternative lenders. So there's always been some sort of fundamental lender that allows you to be able to purchase a house with some sort of loan, which we call mortgages, of course, for residential properties. So that is a fundamental that stays in place. If that was to stop, then obviously that would be a change to the fundamentals. The property cycle, and this is kind of why we have a property cycle. So the property cycle is simply, and I've done again some videos on this already. The property cycle is once we have a property crash, we have 4 years of contraction. And the early recovery stage. Then we have 7 years of growth. The growth is fairly muted, and particularly in the UK, it tends to be in the southeastern part of England. And then as you get into the second one, we tend to have a mid-cycle sort of like downturn, which would be 2019, 2020 in current situation, and then we have a further growth of 7 years leading to another crash. And part of the reason that we have that cycle is that it really comes down to the last one here on the fundamentals, is that banks favor land-based assets to lend on. So it is much easier to get lending for a land-based situation than it is for perhaps like starting a new business or investing in a new business, because that has not a tangible asset, whereas the banks want to go for tangible assets, so that if things don't go right, they've got something where they can recover the loan amount that they've given to you. So those are the fundamentals, and that's what creates the property cycle, because eventually the land values rise to a point where they become uneconomic to develop, and that then creates a situation where the major house builders start to withdraw from the land market and start to contract what they're building, and then what you start to see is you start to see that affect the rest of the stock market. Their shares start to go down, and then the rest of the stock market then goes into a crash cycle. And so what you will always find is, although what actually happens and what appears to happen are slightly different. So what actually happens is that the whole development stops, and then the stock market realizes a stop, it then dips, and then you start to see the housings dip. But what actually is happening is it's really the land that has caused the whole thing to start. And then conversely, when we start to recover, you'll start to see the stock market recover first, and then you'll start to see activity in terms of new building. So that's kind of the fundamentals. The circumstances are interest rates. So interest rates go up and down. Now, a lot of people are thinking that we have very high interest rates at the moment. Actually, we are in the historical norm. In fact, in 2007, 2008, I had mortgages and the rate was higher than it is now. The problem is that we've had low interest rates for such a long period of time that many people have entered the market and not understood that where interest rates were was an unusual set of circumstances. Conversely, I've also seen interest rates go very much higher than they are today. In fact, I've seen 17, 18% interest rates, particularly in the 70s and 80s, and that didn't actually cause the housing market to crash. So it's really down to the affordability, and this kind of brings into the second thing. So when there's a lack of lending, then and the banks pull back from lending to the housing market, then you start to see house prices drop, because there's a lack of availability of finance, and you therefore then can finance the deal. So a lack of lending has not happened as yet. The banks, a lot of people think we're a similar situation to 2008. We're not. 2008, the banks had overextended themselves. They had really done some really stupid things. I won't go into it, but essentially you could almost sign your name and say, this is my income, and they wouldn't check it out. We're not in that. The bank's balance sheets are much stronger position, and so while they may be cautious about lending, they're not going to be withdrawing from the lending market. When they withdraw from the lending market, then that will cause a crash. So we're not there yet, but that is just a circumstance, because they will return to the market, or alternative lenders will come into the market. So for instance, the banks used to get heavily involved in development finance. They pulled back from that. Most of them have not returned to that, but alternative lenders came up. So there's always kind of a new source of lending. So lack of lending is just a circumstance. It can be temporary. It can be pretty much temporary. Same as interest rates. They are going to go up and down. So that doesn't change really. It's just a change of circumstances. Income multiples. That kind of affects how much you're going to be able to borrow. I've seen income multiples. If you go back into the 70s, it was 2.5 times your salary and 1 time as a wife's salary. So a man could borrow 2.5 times. A woman could only borrow 1 time their salary. So there's great disparity there. And in fact, I was speaking to a friend of mine recently, and he had actually taken a mortgage out in 1978, and he said that the income multiple was actually down to 1.75, and his wife couldn't borrow, couldn't be considered in the loan application. And that was fundamentally because the interest rates has risen. So what you will find is that if interest rates were to rise significantly more, the multiple that you would be able to borrow would be reduced. So that's, again, it's just a change in circumstances, because that's going to vary over time. It's not a fundamental change. And that obviously then reflects the number of repayments. So typically in the 1970s, a repayment mortgage was somewhere between 15 and 20 years. Today, it can be 25 to 35 and perhaps higher. In fact, in Japan, they have repayment mortgages of 100 years. I hope we don't end up in that situation, but the banks are always going to extend in a way that they can actually still give lending. And that will continue to always affect house prices. So when you extend the repayment period, that means that people can afford to pay a higher price. and when they can afford to pay a higher price, they're going to outbid other people, and that's going to cause property prices to rise. A significant reason why we're not in that crash cycle that everybody seems to think that we are, and I mentioned this in this video a few weeks ago, is that we have a very high savings rate. Our savings rate is 15%, which is historically very, very high, and that money is going to get released into the economy and start to inflate house prices. And if you want to have a look at what's happening perhaps in another country in the world, if you look at the US, they have negative 3% savings rate. So significantly different we have an 18% margin between our savings rates and theirs, and you're starting to see significant price rises happening in the US, and prices are going up. So we're not there yet. If the cycle remains on trend, we're looking around 2026, 2027 before we're going to actually see any significant reduction in house prices. And that itself will be determined on how quickly how much we get growth over the next few years. So the critical thing to watch is how much do house prices grow over the next year. If it's a fairly shallow growth, then we're not going to see such a significant dip once we hit that 2026, 2027 period. If we see a very sharp rise, then you can expect a much more significant dip. So that's kind of it for this video. Incidentally, if you're interested in property development, we have a Facebook group called Property Development UK. Please come and join us. It's a very small group at the moment, and it's an opportunity to ask questions and interact with other people who are interested in property development. If you're new to the channel, please subscribe and like and share this video. And until the next time, I look forward to speaking to you then. Take care. Bye-bye.